In 1935, a short documentary called Coalface captured 11 minutes of British industrial life. But within those 11 minutes lies a complex web of desire, power, and class that tell us more about Britain's social fabric than its makers might have intended. To understand the documentary gaze of the 1930s, we need to journey back to Victorian London, to a remarkable social experiment that would shape how Britain's upper class viewed and desired the working class. The year is 1880. London is a city divided. In the West End, the wealthy live in comfort. In the East End, poverty and disease run rampant. But something interesting is about to happen. A group of privileged men decided to do something new. They move into the poorest neighbourhoods of London. They call it the settlement movement, and it changed how Britain's classes interact to this day. These settlement houses weren't just charity operations, they represented a new way of thinking about poverty. Instead of seeing poor people as morally flawed, the common Victorian view at the time, the settlement movement argued that poverty had social causes that needed social solutions. These settlement houses offered food, shelter, and education to its neighbours, but more importantly, it created spaces where classes could mix. Middle-class volunteers, initially only men, would live alongside the poor, ostensibly to share culture and knowledge, but we need to look closer at how these interactions were structured. The educated men positioned themselves as benefactors, yet they're also observers, studying the working class life with an intensity that goes beyond mere social reform. Historian Seth Colvin argues that these houses served another purpose. They provided a socially acceptable way for upper-class men to desire working-class men. Under the guise of charity and education, they could observe and interact with and even touch these working-class bodies. Quote, "While ostensibly these men came to heal the wounds of a class-divided nation, it seems probable that many were also driven by the need to come to terms with their own sexualities. This desire often manifested in seemingly innocent ways: health inspections, gymnasium classes, swimming lessons, but the power dynamic was clear. One class observed while the other was observed." The settlement movement peaked in the 1920s, just as the documentary film movement was beginning, but its influence extended far beyond its official end. There are many parallels between the settlement movement and the documentary film movement. Like the settlement movement, documentary filmmakers claim to be learning from their subjects. Like the Victorian settlers, they approached working class communities as if studying an exotic culture. John Grierson, father of British film documentaries and the producer of Coalface, said, quote, "Our gentlemen explore the native haunts and investigate the native customs of Tanganyika and Timbuktu, but do not travel dangerously into the jungles of Middlesbrough and the Clyde." When Grierson talks about documentarists exploring the native haunts of industrial Britain, he's drawing on a tradition established by those Victorian settlers. Both groups saw themselves as explorers venturing into unknown territory. But while the Victorian settlers limited themselves to London's East End, the documentarists pushed further north. The territory had expanded, but the gaze remained the same: privileged men observing, documenting, and desiring working class bodies. Even the way bodies were presented followed similar patterns. The settlement movement's focus on physical health and hygiene finds its echo in documentary films' lingering shots of miners' bodies. The settlement movement believed that social reform was best achieved through private charity rather than government intervention. This idea that change should come through education and cultural exchange rather than systemic reform would deeply influence the documentary movement. When we watch Coalface and other 1930s documentaries, we're seeing the continuation of a Victorian tradition, a tradition of looking, desiring, and representing that began in those settlement houses 50 years earlier. Understanding this history helps us see why these documentaries took the form they did. The lingering camera, the focus on bodies, the mixture of social concern and voyeurism, all of these had precedent in the settlement movement's complex relationship with the working class. Born in 1898 to a schoolmaster father and a suffragette mother, Grierson grew up with an unusual combination of liberal politics and strict Calvinist morality. For him, work wasn't just labor, it was a way to prove oneself worthy in the sight of God. A failure to work was a moral failure to Grierson. When war broke out, the young Grierson wasn't content with his position as a munitions worker. He added a year to his age to join the Navy as a telegraphist. This desire to prove himself and to be tested would later echo through his documentaries. After the war, Grierson threw himself into political engagement at the University of Glasgow. He joined the Fabian Society, a socialist organisation, as well as the Labour and Critics Clubs. But his most formative experience was yet to come. In 1923, armed with a master's in English and moral philosophy, Grierson headed to America to study something that would shape everything that followed, the psychology of propaganda. In Chicago, where he conducted his research, Grierson observed a democracy in crisis. Citizens seemed disconnected from civic life, unmoved by traditional political discourse. But rather than blame the public, Grierson saw a failure of communication. The problem, as he saw it, wasn't that people were stupid or uninterested. The problem was that nobody had figured out how to make complex social issues accessible to ordinary citizens. Traditional media, newspapers, speeches, and pamphlets weren't reaching people effectively. But there was one medium that did reach people. In America's movie houses, Grierson watched as audiences engaged deeply with what they saw on screen. This was where he began to develop his theory of film as education. It was during this period also that Grierson, reviewing Robert Flaherty's Moana, first used the term documentary, calling it a film of documentary value. But he wasn't just naming a genre, he was imagining its potential. Drawing on his study of wartime propaganda, Grierson understood film's power to shape public opinion, but he wanted to use this power not for manipulation, but for education. For Grierson, documentary would be, in his famous phrase, quote, the creative treatment of actuality. Creative because it needed to engage viewers, treatment because raw reality wasn't quite enough, it needed shaping, and actuality because it had to be grounded in real life. Returning to Britain in 1927, Grierson found a country still struggling with the aftermath of World War I and the challenges of industrialization. The timing was perfect for his ideas about film as a tool for social education. When Grierson joined the Empire Marketing Board in 1929, he was joining an organization with a specific commercial mission, to promote trade within the British Empire. But Grierson saw an opportunity for something more ambitious. The EMB's film unit, under Grierson's leadership, would become a training ground for a generation of filmmakers. But more than that, it would become a laboratory for testing his theories about how documentary could serve democracy. Drifters, Grierson's first film, was ostensibly about herring fishing in the North Sea, but when we look closer, we see something else. Watch how he frames the fishermen, the dramatic angles, the emphasis on their labor, the dignity of their work. This wasn't just about selling fish, it was about showing working class life as heroic and meaningful. The film uses sophisticated modern techniques, the rhythmic editing, the dramatic composition, but despite the modernism of it all, Grierson wasn't calling for a revolution, he was calling for understanding. When Drifters premiered alongside Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, the comparison was inevitable. Both films showed workers, both used dynamic editing, both celebrated labor. But while Eisenstein's workers rise up against their oppressors, Grierson's fishermen work within the system. While Potemkin calls for revolution, Drifters calls for recognition and reform. The film's reception as radical says more about Britain's anxiety about class representation than about Grierson's actual politics. He was interested in evolution and not revolution. Grierson's talent was in recognizing that documentary could serve multiple masters, fulfilling the EMB's commercial mission while advancing his own agenda of social education. He could promote empire trade while also promoting the understanding between classes. All of this background is necessary to understand Coalface. The film's complex treatment of class, labor, and masculinity grows directly from Grierson's vision of documentary as a tool for social education, even as it reveals tensions and desires he might not have intended to capture. When we talk about British geography, we often think in simple terms, north and south. But in the 1930s documentary movement, north meant something far more complex than a compass direction. Mapping it out, Lancashire, Yorkshire, Wearside, Tyneside, and even South Wales became conceptually the North. As cultural critic Philip Dodd puts it, this North was, quote, less a number of particular places with specific histories and more a place with an agreed iconography. But what exactly was this iconography? You can see the contrasts. London has its financial districts, its society, and its cultural institutions, while the North is portrayed as only having chimneys, factories, and mines. One represents the capital, and one represents the labor. One represents refinement, and the other raw physical power. The division wasn't just economic, though. It was deeply gendered. As Dodd notes, quote, the North is masculine, working class, and physical. The South, feminine, middle class, and spiritual. This wasn't just metaphorical, it shaped how documentarists saw and portrayed these regions. Stepping back a generation, when Victorian social reformers wanted to study the working class, they rarely ventured beyond London's East End. Their journey into darkness was just a short ride away. But the 1930s documentarists pushed further. They went to places that seemed genuinely foreign to their London sensibilities. But the irony is, their representations often had more to do with pre-existing ideas than direct observation and interaction with the people of the North. The North they portrayed was one that already existed in the public imagination, shaped by novels and newspapers and music hall stereotypes. It was a land of tough men doing tough work, a masculine space that both attracted and intimidated Southern observers. This wasn't just a cultural fantasy, it reflected real economic margins. London's wealth stood in stark contrast to industrial poverty, but the documentarists transformed this economic geography into something more symbolic. Look at how they filmed these landscapes. Towering chimneys, vast factories, deep mines, all captured with a mix of awe and anxiety. These weren't just industrial sites, they were monuments of a kind of masculinity that the documentarists both admired and feared. The coal mines specifically fascinated them. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were symbolic spaces where men proved their masculinity through daily confrontation with danger and death. Compare this to how they saw Southern labour, office workers, civil servants, and businessmen. The documentarists, themselves products of this world, seemed to question their own masculinity in comparison to Northern physical labour. The physical journey north paralleled a psychological one. These documentarists weren't just travelling to another part of Britain, they were crossing boundaries of class, culture, and gender. Grierson wasn't entirely wrong when he compared their work to exploring native haunts. They approached the North almost as internal colonizers, seeing it as a space to be documented, explained, and ultimately controlled through their lens. But this wasn't just about representation. The North represented real economic margins, real poverty, real hardship. The documentary movement's portrayal of these regions both highlighted and obscured these realities somehow. When they filmed housing conditions or workplace safety, they were documenting genuine social issues, but their focus on masculine labor and physical prowess just overshadowed broader questions of economic justice. So when we're saying that these documentarists went north, we're talking about a journey across multiple boundaries: geographical, economic, cultural, but also psychological. They were mapping not just industrial Britain, but their own complex relationship with class and masculinity. And nowhere is this more evident than in Coalface, where all these threads, geography, class, gender, power, come together in 11 minutes of documentary footage that tell us as much about the observers as the observed. The film begins with a brief description of coal and its byproducts, followed by footage of the mines and a map showing their locations and production levels. For a minute or two, there is no trace of the men that work there. There are no miners, there are no people at all. It is purely coal. The story is being told by a disembodied voice of authority, talking to people who we suspect know nothing about the mines, ostensibly the middle class. When we are finally introduced to the miners, it is with shadowed group shots, depicting them collectively as a workforce and then shifting almost abruptly into more intimate portrayals. The transition is marked by a striking cut from a group of miners entering the shaft to an individual miner removing his shirt. The camera employs a visual language that eroticizes the miner's body using 3 distinct techniques, as Marsha Bryant points out. The bright lighting makes the miner's torso glisten, emphasizing sweat and physicality. Close-up framing isolates body parts, the torso, the arms, the legs, creating a dismembered effect that draws attention to the miner's muscular form rather than his individuality. Voyeuristic angles, often framing the miner from behind, in profile, or over the shoulder, positioning the viewer as an onlooker, heightening the sense of physical admiration. These scenes use light and shadow to sculpt the miners' bodies. In Coalface, the camera gets closer than in earlier films, emphasizing flesh contours, visible sweat, and body hair. This proximity intensifies the homoerotic undertones as the camera fixates on physical details rather than the broader industrial context. This framing is particularly voyeuristic. The miner is positioned in the lower left corner of the frame, surrounded by darkness, which amplifies the intimacy of the act and heightens the viewer's sense of looking in on a private moment. Unlike other shots where miners appear unaware of the camera, this scene momentarily disrupts the voyeuristic dynamic. The men face the camera, acknowledging the presence of the viewer, subtly challenging the framing of their bodies as mere objects of desire. They have their shirts draped over their shoulders, they are trying to cover up, and they are also attempting to speak to the audience, but of course unsuccessfully. The voices that are played over had been dubbed later in the studio and did not belong to the miners in the film.
The coal's boiling out here today, Lou. Up at Guy Evans' place, it's real stiff.
The commentary itself contributes to the erotic framing at times. References to heat and nakedness draw attention to the miner's physicality, momentarily steering the viewer away from the socio-economic narrative to focus on the miner's bodies once again. This closing shot reaffirms the voyeuristic framing, with the miner's body displayed as a site of both physical labor and eroticized spectacle. The composition of the frame, with the miner moving away into the shadows, mirrors the viewer's role as an onlooker, lingering on the physicality of the miner's work. The documentary's use of fragmented bodies and stark lighting and intimate framing positions the miners as symbols of both labor and desire. It is this duality, where industrial work becomes intertwined with physical admiration, that defines the visual language of Coalface. The documentary now leads us outside, where we hear a poem sung by a woman's chorus as the miners leave the pit, adding a layer of lyrical reflection.
The miner's life is bound up with the pit. The miner's house is often owned by the pit. The life of the village depends on the pit.
Initially, the poem seems to reinforce heterosexual imagery, pairing the miner with a female figure, Kate. But Marsha Bryan argues that closer analysis reveals homoerotic undercurrents. The miner is both active in his physical labor and passive as the object of the narrator's and the viewer's gaze. The woman's chorus functions as a mask for male homoerotic desire, making it socially acceptable while simultaneously subverting traditional gender roles. The irregular rhyme scheme of the poem, linking lines 1 and 8, reinforces a focus on male figures rather than the supposed heterosexual coupling of the miner and Kate. The 1930s presented a unique crisis of masculinity in Britain. Too young for the Great War and not yet tested by the Spanish Civil War or World War II, a generation of men found themselves grappling with new anxieties about their role and identity. George Orwell captured this unease in his piercing observation: "Because I have been to public school, I am a eunuch. I can produce medical evidence to the contrary, but what good will it do?" His words reflect the frustration of men who, though shaped by privilege, felt disconnected from the raw physical vitality they admired in industrial workers. This masculinity crisis shaped the British documentary film movement in many ways. Documentarists sought to resolve their anxieties through direct engagement with industrial Britain, mirroring the Victorian settlement movement's ethos of bridging class divides. Men like Orwell didn't just observe, they immersed themselves, with Orwell ultimately taking up arms in Spain a few years later. At the same time, these filmmakers constructed a masculine identity for the documentary form itself. Paul Rother, a close collaborator of Grierson, proclaimed documentary, quote, "the most virile of all kinds of films," while John Grierson described himself and his colleagues as documentary men fighting synthetic nonsense in their battle for authenticity. This gendering of the genre intertwined with their representations of industrial Britain, which they depicted as ruggedly masculine, with chimneys piercing the sky and miners embodying raw physical strength. The camera became both a tool of observation and desire. Coal miners, central to films like Coalface, were framed in ways that emphasized their muscularity, their sweat, and their laboring bodies, often lit dramatically to accentuate contours of flesh. Shots of miners' backs, arms, and legs positioned the viewer as a voyeur, admiring these real men as both objects of respect and desire. This homoerotic gaze underscored the complex dynamics of class, gender, and power that shaped these films. Yet, for all their visual power, these films downplayed the eroticism of their imagery through authoritative voiceovers, framing the miners as stoic symbols of industrial Britain rather than individuals. Still, for male documentarists, such images provided a sense of identification, celebrating virility. For queer collaborators like W.H. Auden and Benjamin Britten, these films constructed industrial masculinity as a site of aesthetic and sexual fascination. Caught between their own insecurities and the heroic masculinity of their subjects, the documentarists of the 1930s ultimately forged a new narrative, one that celebrated labor, masculinity, and authenticity, while simultaneously revealing their own struggles with what it meant to be a man. British documentarists viewed the industrial North through the same imperialist lens they used for colonial territories, places to observe, civilize, and most importantly, control. This colonial mindset was not new. The Victorian settlement had done the same in London's East End. But by the 1930s, the industrial North had become Britain's internal colony, a space defined not by its people's voices, but by the narratives imposed upon them and the work that they could do for the rest of the empire. The documentarists of this era, like Victorian reformers, approached their subjects with a mix of fascination, paternalism, and voyeurism. Every mining documentary made since the 1930s has emphasized the dangers of industrial labor, often citing grim statistics about injuries and fatalities.
Every working day, 4 miners are killed, and over 450 injured and maimed.
These numbers underscored urgent social issues, but also reinforced the miners' images as paragons of masculine courage, risking their lives daily in the pits. No figure captivated the documentarists more than the coal miner. His physique became a focal point for the camera. The lingering gaze served dual purposes. For straight male viewers, the miner epitomized rugged masculinity, an ideal of physical resilience and strength. For gay collaborators and audiences, these images offered something more subversive, a sensual appreciation of the male form, framed by the miner's sweat, muscle, and the raw intensity of their work. In Coalface, the camera's intimate framing, torso glistening, hands gripping tools, backs bent under strain, constructed miners as heroic laborers and objects of visual desire. Shots of miners drinking or wiping sweat added an almost tactile immediacy, blurring the line between admiration and eroticization. The miners' bodies became sites of multiple meanings: endurance, sacrifice, and sensuality. The influence of Coalface and its contemporaries extended far beyond the immediate context. These films set the foundations of modern documentary filmmaking, from their observational style to their focus on social issues. But their true legacy lies in their ability to capture a moment when class, sexuality, and power collided in profoundly revealing ways. Today, Coalface stands as more than a chronicle of industrial Britain. It is a layered text offering insights into how representation intersects with power and desire. Its frames oscillate between social reform and voyeurism, education and sensuality, heroism and exploitation. In just 11 minutes, Coalface distills the contradictions of its time: class solidarity and class tourism, social empathy and social control, masculine idealization, and masculine crisis. It reminds us that documentaries are not neutral mirrors of desire. They are curated acts of looking, shaped by who holds the camera, who speaks, and who is framed as an object of observation. The next time you revisit an old documentary, if you ever do, look beyond the surface. In the space between what is shown and what is silenced, what is spoken and what is left unsaid, lies the true complexity of the story.